Because I can now welcome our next speaker. Oh, did I do something bad? Joseph Foley, by the way. Sorry, I've done something weird there. He's Paul Gillis-Smith. He's from Harvard and is again to talk to us about, I'm using to Harvard Divinity School, is that right? Yeah. To talk to us about using chaplaincy in ketamine-assisted therapy. So I'll hand.
Thank you. Okay, hello everyone. My name is Paul Gillis-Smith. I'm a recent graduate from Harvard's Master of Divinity program, and I'm an incoming project lead for the study on psychedelics in society and culture at Harvard Divinity School's Center for the Study of World Religions. A huge thanks to all of our organizers for this conference, to Christine Hoskeller, Mark Schuneman, Joseph Crickmore, Anya Ovcharenko, and the chair of this panel, Celia Morgan, and my co-panelists, Jeff and Roz. I must say I feel a little bit out of my depth today and quite humble presenting alongside the two of you with your wealth of experience and leadership in this field. So I have a few remarks to share with you about my work in spiritual care integration for ketamine patients. I'll clarify some introductory terms to situate us all, and then speak on the word psychedelic and its relationship to ketamine, and further the psychedelic and its relationship to chaplaincy. Then I'll provide my understanding of integration based on my set as a chaplain, my setting in an American hospital, and share what our program looks like. And I'll conclude with some implications that I see chaplaincy might offer to the field of psychedelic therapy and integration more broadly. So I was invited to speak to you all today about my experience working as a hospital chaplain during my graduate studies, where I provided spiritual care to patients receiving ketamine and esketamine for major depressive disorder. Now, just in this brief introduction, there are two key terms that may require some further elaboration for this audience: esketamine for one, and chaplaincy or spiritual care for two. Now, esketamine. We hear about ketamine more often, sometimes associated in the underground with raves and K-holes under the name Special K or simply K. Ketamine was first synthesized in 1962 by a Park Davis chemist, patented by the company in 1965 as an anesthetic for humans and other animals. Ketamine became much more popular in the late 70s, following John Lilly's personal testimonial in his book, The Scientist. In the 2010s, there was a swell of research into ketamine's utility for the treatment of depression, and the American Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, granted ketamine breakthrough designation in order to fast-track clinical trials. This is not my expertise at all, but it's worth a couple notes here on the difference between ketamine and esketamine, at least to highlight how drug patents work in the clinical context. So ketamine is what is called a racemic mixture, meaning that it includes an equal mixture of two enantiomers, or compounds that are mirror images of each other, like our hands, yet not identical to each other. Thus, the two can be separated into each enantiomer, S-ketamine, R-ketamine. The S-ketamine enantiomer has a much higher binding affinity to NMDA receptors, which is an inhibitory receptor for glutamate, which is the primary excitatory neurotransmitter in human brains. And we believe it to be in part responsible for neuronal plasticity and memory formation. So what ketamine and esketamine do is block the reception of glutamate by NMDA receptors, allowing for glutamate to basically run wild through our brain. And while the causal mechanism is still unknown, this glutamate action is thought to be the potential cause of ketamine's antidepressive effects. So as glutamate is blocked at the NMDA receptors, it passes through the AMPA receptors, whose mediating role of glutamate transmission is responsible for the molecular machinery of memory and learning. So thus, given ketamine's mechanism of action and glutamate's transmission through the molecular activities that undergird memory and learning, it seems to play a crucial role in what we might call consciousness and the various activities associated with it: insight, intuition, discovery, etc. So because of this binding affinity to NMDA receptors that esketamine has, Janssen Pharmaceuticals pushed forward Spravato, a nasal spray form of esketamine. Janssen received FDA and European Medicines Agency approval for their Spravato esketamine in 2019. And it's the brand of esketamine offered at the hospital where I did my work, and the primary ketamine or ketamine adjacent drug prescribed there as well. Now for chaplaincy or spiritual care, as it's often called now. Chaplain has a Latin origin, capellanus, named as such because the capellani protected the relic of 4th century Saint Martin. There he is. Half of his capa or cape is the relic. The other half was given to a beggar. The name was later given to the building that the capellani and their relic, the capella, would occupy, the chapel. From the 6th to the 9th centuries, the capellani became clerical ministers appointed by the king, and they were associated with monarchical or military duties along with guarding the relics. Thus, the chaplain, differentiated from the minister or the monastic, had a specific assignment to a personage, typically a royal leader. But it was not until the early 20th century that chaplaincy became associated with assignment to a new personage, the patient and their hospitals, the more immediate legacy of my own discipline. Given this deep Christian association with chaplaincy, contemporary practitioners have often opted for the more neutral spiritual care. So I'll use the two terms interchangeably here. Hospital chaplaincy has its origins in psychiatry, perhaps making it uniquely attuned for its current charge in psychedelic medicine. The founder of hospital chaplaincy, Anton Boysen, was a mental patient himself. He carried a diagnosis of schizophrenia, and it was during his first institutionalization in a Boston asylum that he had the idea, or perhaps the revelation, for religious officials taking a place in the asylum staff. For Anton Boysen, chaplaincy was a project intended specifically for mentally ill patients, and it was the work of the chaplain to help patients make sense of their psychosis on a different set of terms than those provided by clinical staff. It was Boysen's belief that one man's psychosis may be another's religious experience. This was his own issue during his hospitalization. Boysen understood his psychotic thinking as an altered state for otherwise inaccessible creativity or problem solving, and brought on by a set of circumstances of duress that required a new view of a situation. And he yearned for the help of a professional with religious training to help him make sense of these experiences on the terms of religion, a chaplain. Not 5 years after his internment, his first internment, first of 5, in an asylum, did he become the first of such chaplains. In his first major text on madness and religious experience, The Exploration of the Inner World, Boysen describes his patients as prophets, always ready to put them into conversation with the likes of Jesus Christ, St. Paul of Tarsus, and George Fox. Thus, as a discipline, spiritual care must always acknowledge and be responsive to the wisdom of a patient. So as with the psychopharmacology of ketamine, the history of chaplaincy and its knotty relationship with the history of psychiatry and madness is not the subject of my lecture today. I'll only highlight here that this loose class of psychedelic drugs have also been called psychosis-inducing or psychotomimetic in the past. Given chaplaincy's history as psychiatrically oriented and specially invested in questions of madness, the chaplain seems uniquely fit to work with patients enduring what one may call a sort of madness and taking a drug that some continue to claim is madness-inducing. So perhaps I can speak more to these themes in our Q&A. So hopefully this meandering introduction helps us situate us all a bit in who I am as I stand before you today. Now, to turn to the psychedelic of psychedelic integration, the theme of this ongoing colloquium that hosts our conference. I keep a running list for every name I hear for this poorly defined class of psychotropic drugs. Among them includes, of course, the early option offered by Huxley, phanerothym, in the now apocryphal limerick, to make this trivial world sublime, take 1/2 gram phanerothym. Less well known are psychophrenic, psychoplastic, psychorexic, psychohormic, phaneropsychic, psychophan, and on and on and on. And just as coming to a single word for this loose set of drugs poses a challenge, there is a similar ambivalence about which drugs count as sufficiently psychedelic. With a fairly quick Google search, I encountered a handful of blog posts from various American ketamine providers, each offering beautifully contradictory declarations. Why ketamine is a psychedelic. Why ketamine infusion therapy is not psychedelic therapy. why ketamine is a psychedelic and why it matters. Is ketamine a psychedelic? Does it matter? Suffice it to say, the American mental health care industry appears divided over the use value of calling ketamine a psychedelic. Perhaps it is for the curious associations that psychedelic picked up since the word's invention in 1956. Ketamine is unique in the psychedelic landscape as it did not experience the same crackdown under the 1970 Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act in the US. In fact, in the very year that this was the very year that it was approved for clinical use as an anesthetic by the FDA. So since the 1980s, psychiatric researchers have explored the novel potentials of this drug for mental health benefits. Like many novel explorations by psychiatrists, clinicians threw every diagnosis in the kitchen sink at it to see what might stick. Substance use disorders, treatment refractory depression, anxiety, PTSD, BPD, OCD, and on and on and on. Given ketamine's peculiar phenomenological effects, a sense of disconnection from the body, a feeling of thoughts running loose through one's mind, the odd hallucination, perhaps, psychedelic therapy, as a term, has been lent credence as a paradigm of care for patients receiving this drug. Now, there's the previously noted consternation over whether it counts sufficiently as a psychedelic. Psychedelic has never had a clear-cut definition. It gestures to a loose set of drugs, psilocybin-containing mushrooms, Amanita muscaria, LSD, occasionally MDMA, peyote, 2CB, DMT, etc. It's also a visual aesthetic. It's a musical genre. It's a literary style, or it's simply used to denote the weird. Perhaps this is why psychedelic therapy might be so easily established as a new kind of therapy. A new book, a new drug, a new chord progression, a new therapy. To my mind, psychedelic chaplaincy serves as an intervention to this hermeneutic of novelty that governs the meaning of psychedelic. One of the few publications on psychedelic chaplaincy, Chaplaincy and Psychedelic Therapy, Opportunities and Barriers, offers several crucial observations on how chaplaincy might be uniquely equipped to address this hermeneutic of novelty. First, as noted earlier, clinical chaplaincy has its roots in providing care for people experiencing non-ordinary states of consciousness. Second, the discipline of chaplaincy provides a standard of care and expertise that is not rooted in the newness of psychedelicism, but in the accredited training by the Association for Clinical Pastoral Education, or the ACPE. The ACPE is not a licensing board for psychedelic chaplains. Rather, it is an accrediting and educating organization for all chaplains and spiritual care providers in all settings. The philosophy of the ACPE is that the clinical pastoral education provides the skills for the variety of contexts that chaplains find themselves in with the same standard of care. An ethic of compassion, non-anxious presence, interreligious and interspiritual sensitivity, withholding the need to find solutions, staying present through challenging and painful situations, and holding space for non-ordinary states, among other competencies. I once heard it said that to be a good psychedelic therapist, one must become a good therapist. I do hope that this is borne out in anyone who has invested in psychedelic therapy, although a number of disclosures from MDMA clinical trials suggest that the power dynamics and impressionable states fomented by these novel therapeutics has been abused by some therapists. Certainly not a majority, but troublesome nonetheless. Similarly, I think that to be a psychedelic chaplain, one must become a good chaplain. Because the training for chaplaincy is the same for anyone's domain of spiritual care, this creates a stopgap for someone with myopic interest in psychedelics, as they receive the same training as someone in palliative care, inpatient psychiatric care, or general inpatient internal medicine care. The same competencies apply for all patient populations, and those interested in ketamine, psilocybin, or MDMA chaplaincy have much to learn from their peers working in other spheres of spiritual care. I took this call myself, and I split my clinical time evenly between working with patients receiving ketamine and general psychiatric patients in a locked ward and in a day program. So this paucity that chaplaincy provides to the impulse towards psychedelic novelty is an integral parallel to the history of psychedelics more generally. As mentioned, psychedelic is a new term. It's often applied retroactively to plants, fungi, and chemicals found transculturally and transhistorically. Nobody in South America who drank ayahuasca ceremonially considered their practice psychedelic until fairly recently, if at all. Mazatec healers in Chotachine in Oaxaca were not referring to their mushrooms as psychedelics, and they did not consider their work psychedelic therapy. And the use of ergotized grain, which is chemically similar to LSD, was not considered psychedelic at any point in history when it may have been used for cultic or pharmacological ends. Chaplaincy walks in step with this history. There's no need to appeal to the novel. Psychedelic chaplaincy is not a new approach. To be sure, chaplaincy in a psychedelic setting may have new lessons for spiritual care in other domains, but psychedelic chaplaincy is chaplaincy first. Psychedelic chaplaincy, then, is a particular flavor of this integration that we're interrogating here. I think the theme of this conference is terrific, as it's dealing head-on with an often ill-defined, or at least multifariously defined concept. My own use of the term feels mostly out of necessity, as it's become the recognized currency for therapeutically relating to care seekers receiving psychotropic drugs. And there are many ways in which spiritual care is wholly related to integration in the many contexts that one might find a chaplain, from the prison to the military to the university to the hospital. And I think it's worth revisiting our old friends Gottfried Leibniz and Bernard Riemann in their early formulations of the integral and his notation with the extended S for summa, calculating a sum of a line under a curve. Our mathematician friends aid us in an understanding of integration, wherein it is a project of generating a sum by calculating an infinite number of discrete moments under a curve, or such a curve in integration is the arc of a life. Spiritual care is uniquely attuned to how a patient is making sense or struggling to do so of a particular clinical encounter, or of the infinity of moments that comprise a clinical experience, whether they are receiving acute care in an ICU, recovering from a surgical procedure, enduring a short-term psychiatric stay, or processing a ketamine infusion. A chaplain usually steps into a patient's life for only a brief moment to ask, what the hell do you make of all this? Or at least that's what I'm usually asking. At times, my work as a chaplain seems at a distance from the immediate cure of bodily suffering. I don't perform surgeries, I don't prescribe medication, I'm not even changing wound dressings or even bed linens. Yet these encounters are an attempt at integrating, at making sense of the often dehumanizing or at least confusing set of experiences that make up what we call healthcare. Our approach to ketamine spiritual care integration deviates from the standard practice in contemporary spiritual care in that it is not a brief single visit, but it resonates with the longer history of chaplaincy and Anton Boyson's work in mental institutions, where we have the opportunity to connect with care seekers over weeks or months. Our program currently consists of 8 one-on-one integration sessions on a weekly or bi-weekly basis, followed by an opt-in integration group, which meets for 8 sessions. Our integration clinic is interdisciplinary. It's currently consisting of 2 Divinity School student chaplains, 2 psychiatric medical residents, and the hospital's spiritual care manager. As ketamine is self-administered, and patients receive their infusion in an outpatient infusion center. It looks just like this. With supervision from a nursing team, which I would argue this setting does not make for a conducive environment to pleasant or rewarding experiences. And it has been a central and ongoing complaint from our patient population. Thus, our integration time is sometimes focused on helping patients control the environment in any way they can. Some opt for eye shades, noise-canceling headphones, particular playlists, or recordings of words from loved ones. Luckily, the hospital is just across the street from an arboretum. And I encourage many patients to go for a walk through the park to ground themselves before or after the infusion. So despite the difference from standard contemporary hospital chaplaincy in the amount of time that we get to spend with a patient, I'm typically asking the same question that I would of any patient on any floor of the hospital. What the hell do you make of all this? A patient responds, and often embedded in their response is a request for a particular helping role. Patients are so rarely asked to integrate their clinical experiences by their own care providers, and even more rarely asked to tell their story in this setting. But this is the task of integration: to sum up, to tell one's story, to bring together an infinite number of moments into what could be construed as a whole. Integration as a mathematical function, or as a catch-all term that is slid into psychedelic therapy, eschews the arduous nature of calculating such a sum, of bringing together one's experience in a meaningful way. And in such an integration, we may require more than one role to help us in the process. Some care seekers are looking for patient advocates. Others are looking for a psychotherapist with particular training, internal family systems, EMDR, psychodynamic therapy, etc. Some are looking for information or for answers, phenomenological, theological, neurological, or most of all, is what I am experiencing normal? Am I crazy? Some are seeking some sort of accountability. As practitioners facilitating integration, we are often asked to step into many of these roles at the same time. And chaplains cannot answer all of these requests. We're not therapists. We do not have deep psychopharmacological knowledge. We are not patient advocates. Yet, it is integral to integration that we walk with a patient in their process of understanding what it is they're looking for, what roles they're requesting of me, the practitioner, and what they are looking for from this treatment. For those among us who walk through the world with depression, it may have been a long time since you had an answer to this question of what you're looking for beyond, I am looking to no longer be depressed. Ketamine opens a unique possibility because it is so fast-acting. These standard measures of depression, like mood or energy level, might suddenly be much higher than they have been for a long time, sometimes 5, 10, 20 years. And it can be incredibly destabilizing to have a new wellspring of energy that was inaccessible for years. Perhaps we're thinking about the future or even making plans more than a week out for the first time. In the chaplaincy biz, we call that hope. What spiritual care looks like here is walking with someone as they respond to these questions. More often than not, we find that just being curious about the question, the search for an answer, is more elucidating and self-empowering than the answer itself. One common word for this practice is witness. We ask someone about what is going on in this moment, and we refuse to turn away, no matter how troublesome, disturbing, or uncomfortable their response is. And as chaplains, we're also specially attuned to the religious or spiritual stakes of one's experience. As mentioned earlier, chaplaincy does not provide a theological frame to a care seeker's experience, but meets them on their own turf. This is of profound ethical import, as it may be easy for someone facilitating integration to provide their own interpretation of a patient's experience and nudge their treatment experiences in a particular direction, and consequently, the meaning the patient makes of those experiences. I'll give an example. I saw a patient who was raised conservative and Pentecostal Christian, who had since been divorced from an abusive partner and had not been to church in many years. When I asked about her relationship to her tradition these days, she expressed feeling quite far from God. Maybe she was even angry at God, but she was unsure how to express it. We then explored what it might mean to express anger at God, and where in her tradition there was room for expressing that anger. We turned to Lamentations, and we considered how we might connect to God, even in the midst of our anger. Her response at the end of our time together was something along the lines of, I've never had someone in healthcare help me process parts of my spiritual life. No one has asked me about the spiritual aspects of my mental health. These conversations are each singular. No two people have the same relationship to or understanding of religion or spirituality. Thus, one cannot take any sort of engagement with religion for granted. And likewise, one must not suggest that a particular sort of religious or spiritual experience may arise from ketamine treatments. I've heard everything from swimming in the glory of God, to descending into hell, to facing down one's own mortality, to basking in the divine light of the universe, to just generally feeling weird for 45 minutes, to totally materialist practices of drug-assisted meditation, as he called them, during the treatment. Thus, I see a crucial lesson that the discipline of spiritual care may offer to integration more generally. Psychedelic science has certainly taken an interest in the presence of spiritual, existential, religious, or theological experiences occasioned by psychoactive drugs, often terming and quantifying them as mystical experiences. Moreover, one line of research investigates whether this mystical quality is also what holds the curative potential, and the project becomes one of boosting the mysticism per the questionnaire of the day. Beyond simply gesturing to a mystical quality, whose definition and character is concretized through a survey of dubious philosophical underpinnings, chaplaincy offers a method of non-imposition and a reliance upon interreligious or interspiritual knowledge. Given the import of the religious dimension of these experiences, for one to integrate this experience well, it should cohere, or at least be in conversation with, one's own positionality in relation to religion or spirituality. Of course, this may also include tabling the conversation on religion or spirituality, should one not bring it to the surface at all, and providing reassurance that one is not broken or doing it wrong if the experience does not possess a spiritual quality, or if each experience is not as impactful or glorious as the last. So by way of conclusion, I'd like to share a few lines from a poem by Walt Whitman, an American transcendentalist, and who are the 19th century progenitors of explorations into contact with the divine, from which the psychedelic Renaissance inherits much. Whitman's poem, The Wound Dresser, provides an elaboration of the work of witness in spiritual care that I simply have not seen stated so clearly anywhere else. Despite our difference in time and setting, as Whitman writes of a wound dresser in a field hospital on a Civil War battlefield some 160 years ago, I find a point of touch through time as we both reckon with the suffering that we witness and a sense of inadequacy of addressing it in the moment. In the American healthcare landscape, I've witnessed far more systemic crises that seem to generate, or at least exacerbate, our mental illnesses than any innate chemical imbalance. Problems of education, of social immobility, of housing, of healthcare costs, at least in the US, of global instability and conflict, these all go ill-addressed by any of the tools at our disposal in psychiatric intervention. From my vantage point as a spiritual care provider, it is the work of witness, of letting people tell as much of their story as they can, and of seeking out spiritual resources together, that has not ameliorated any of these conditions, but illustrated the depth of our collective pain, and let us find new ways to name it together. So I'll let Whitman speak here. Now be witness again. Paint the mightiest armies of earth, of those armies so rapid, so wondrous. What saw you to tell us? What stays with you latest and deepest? Of curious panics, of hard-fought engagements or sieges tremendous, what deepest remains? Bearing the bandages, water and sponge, straight and swift to my wounded I go, where they lie on the ground after the battle brought in, where their priceless blood reddens the grass, the ground. Or to the rows of the hospital tent, or under the roofed hospital, to the long rows of cots up and down each side I return. To each and all, one after another I draw near, not one do I miss. An attendant follows holding a tray. He carries a refuse pail, soon to be filled with clotted rags and blood, emptied and filled again. I onward go, I stop. With hinged knees and steady hand to dress wounds, I am firm with each. The pangs are sharp yet unavoidable. One turns to me, his appealing eyes. Poor boy, I never knew you, yet I think I could not refuse this moment to die for you, if that would save you. Thus in silence and dreams projections, returning, resuming, I thread my way through the hospitals. The hurt and wounded I pacify with soothing hand. I sit by the restless all the dark night. Some are so young, some suffer so much. I recall the experience sweet and sad. Many a soldier's loving arms about this neck have crossed and rested. Many a soldier's kiss dwells on these bearded lips. Thank you.
Wonderful talk, Paul. Thanks. Oh, Mark's already got his hand up. He's got a very loud voice there. You want to shout or no?
I can scream.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Paul. That was really profound. Really, really profound. I'm also working quite a lot on psychedelic chaplaincy as a practice and in theory as well. And yeah, this notion, I mean, especially the story about providing a room to express anger to God and opening up lamentations. My question is quite simple. Is there room for, and I think you do accommodate for this, but I'd like you maybe, if you could explore it a little bit, is there room for a psychedelic chaplaincy outside of the clinic? Given that chaplaincy has also a historical role to play in hospices, in prisons, in schools, universities, etc. Thank you.
Specifically, psychedelic chaplaincy.
Psychedelic chaplaincy outside the clinic, yeah.
Yeah, I think for sure. I mean, sometimes this has been put to me, I'll be in a conversation with somebody, and then afterward they'll say, were you chaplaining me?
Same.
I think there's a sense that you're kind of always carrying it with you, and I think it is a set of skills that could be easily picked up by anyone of interest. I would imagine, so the Zendo project is really compelling to me, that goes to festival spaces and provides a sort of container for bad trips.
Haven't heard of Zendo, but in the UK we have Psycare.
Yeah.
Cosmic Care.
And I think
Zendo, okay.
containers like that would be, I don't think they don't have a spiritual care or chaplaincy model. I think in the festival world, chaplaincy makes a lot of sense. So I think that, I mean, it's yes is the much shorter answer.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, I'll do that.
Just stop share.
Paul, just the second one Mark said, brilliant talk. Thank you very much. Very thought-provoking. You mentioned hermeneutics of novelty. And I'm interested to ask another question, which is integration itself a hermeneutic activity, but a second order hermeneutic activity? Because the subject themselves has to interpret their own experience and then communicate it to a chaplain, who then has to perform a second order hermeneutic act. And are there dangers in that, given the distance from what that person's cognized contents of their experience?
Yeah, I mean, this is the second part of your question. Certainly, dangers is one word. Misunderstandings or you're always falling short, I think, will be the case. This is I think that the mathematical image of this calculation of the sum, it's always an approximation. You're never getting quite there. And I think that integration is the same. You will always be doing something inadequate to the task of interpreting your experience in correspondence with the rest of your life. But that's the game. I mean, I think we sort of work within that sense of inadequacy and don't avoid it. Avoid the fact that will always be a sort of inadequate task.
There's a long history of biblical hermeneutics, but should there be a sort of hermeneutics of chaplaincy to help people to understand what people might be saying about their own experience?
Yeah, I think there's a book about this. Maybe the title is The Hermeneutics of Chaplaincy or something like that. Somebody who's a biblical scholar who's also in the spiritual care world wrote about this sort of interpretive enterprise. I think if it's interpretation that the care seeker is doing, I think that's great. The point of concern I have is where the facilitator, whether a therapist, a chaplain, whoever else, is offering up interpretation for the person. I think a lot of my other work is on Deleuze, and so I bring a lot of that into my chaplaincy work, and he's always marking a space between interpretation and experimentation. And I think it is always open to the chaplain to offer protocol for experimentation. What would it look like if this were the mantra? What would it mean if how do we proliferate experimental protocol and let interpretation be the project of the care seeker?
Thanks. That was a fantastic talk. And yeah, well, hopefully, sorry, because we're doing quite badly for time, but